Hello, and welcome to another episode of Northstar Talks Politics for the monstrous trolls who inevitably are going to come across my video. Let me just start off by saying socialism works. Marxism works. You don't want to even hear someone who can say that. Get lost. This is for the open-minded, or at least those willing to challenge their beliefs enough, if only to refine their retorts. Now, first of all, I won't really be reading this. I'll scroll through this article a little bit. Actually, let me zoom in so it's a little more readable. So you guys can read it as I go. I'll scroll through slowly. It's surprisingly not horrible. It's still bad because the media is controlled in capitalist societies, and there's all sorts of propaganda about Marxism, but this is one of the least bad things that could easily be found, and it just gives something for you guys to see instead of just my outline. Now, first of all, as I said, socialism works. You get all sorts of dumb memes about empty shelves. Usually when people show those pictures, they're showing, which, by the way, modern color photographs. I want you to reflect on that for a second. That comes from, cannot be most of the Soviet Union's existence, because that kind of photography was a recent invention towards the end of the Cold War. It's from the end, invariably from the end, when the system was collapsing. Collapsing systems always have empty shelves and stuff like that. That's been true of all sorts of capitalist empires, like the British Empire when it was really collapsing. Heck, you can find similar stories in the Roman Empire. It's always been true. There's shortages and price shocks. They actually did all sorts of price controls in the late Roman Empire because prices were out of whack and people couldn't get basic goods they needed. Why did this happen? Because collapsing empires have trouble with their supply chains. As happened during COVID, you can see the pictures of the empty shelves at the end of COVID. So, yes, there were empty shelves in the Soviet Union. That doesn't mean the system didn't work. That doesn't mean socialism doesn't work, as if the Soviet Union, Marxist-Leninism, was representative of all socialism. Is not. In fact, I am this is going to be a mouthful, a Marxist Christian democratic socialist. So, not a Marxist-Leninist, first of all. Marxist, because Lenin's theories severely weak in the Soviet Union. They could have done better if they didn't follow a lot of the things Marx said, particularly the most important thing that he was terribly wrong about was the need for all the socialist parties to merge into a single party. While that had some value for initially achieving socialist victory in the Soviet Civil War and getting rid of the czars, the brutal authoritarian monarchs before that. Once socialists are in power, they should have allowed a diversification and a fracturing in the creation of more political parties. It would have actually made their system more stable in the long run, although it would have caused short-term problems for long-term gains. Christian, because Christianity does go in hand with socialism. That is something that, because of some Marxists being militant atheists, unfortunately, you get like the Catholic Church and nonsense trying to soapbox against socialism, but actually, Jesus constantly told rich people they should give all their money away, was constantly talking about inequality and praising the poor and wanting them to live with dignity, and that's what socialism is fundamentally about, and taking care of the vulnerable. It is not, though, government does stuff. Socialism is worker control of the means of production and greater equality, greater respect for those who can't even work. These things naturally tend to follow from socialism, although tend to is a key word. Lenin had some terrible views towards the disabled, for instance, and so that made the Soviet Union less good towards disabled people than it could have been. And for those who don't know, I am disabled with long COVID. I was on the verge of becoming a physician. I had worked very, very hard, taken all sorts of risks, after getting a master's degree, and then getting stuck in a rural area because family fucked me over and gave me bad advice that helped lead me into a situation where I was dependent on them and then didn't follow the promises they made. I have abusive, toxic parents, and it was my mistake for trusting them. But I got stuck in a rural area, had to work some shitty low-wage jobs. Then I managed to relocate. Had been on my field in biotech too long, so I wasn't able to get jobs. I got some interviews at first until I hit the 3-year mark out of my field, at which point I stopped getting interviews. So I retrained as an EMT. My goal had been to make to med school. Through all this, I'd also done stuff like I had tried to get into the military officer candidate school. Couldn't get medical clearance for any branch, but the Marine Corps did get medical clearance for the Marine Corps successfully, but then couldn't get my PT scores high enough because I was too proud to go on food stamps, and I was basically starving, and I couldn't bulk up when I couldn't eat. You have to eat to grow, as one of my current roommates recently said. It's true. You have to eat enough calories or you will not be able to build muscle. And if you can't build enough muscle, you're not going to have high enough PT scores for the United States Marines Officer Candidate School. That's just obvious. I didn't want it that bad. I had my concerns about the way the Marines crushes individuality, doesn't allow free thinking. I much preferred the Air Force or the Navy or the Army because their officers allowed much more independent thought. And I didn't want to lose myself, but I needed the opportunity because I need to get a bad situation economically, develop skills, get letters of recommendation, and hopefully do something medical in the military was the idea, and eventually go to med school, become a military physician, military surgeon, Army surgeon is what I originally envisioned, or a Navy surgeon, maybe like a ship's surgeon or something. Didn't happen. Anyways, then I, after working as an EMT for a while, I took a coworker's advice, applied to special master's programs, got in, combined that with another master's degree for job security, something that had much more employable skill set in case I didn't make it to med school. Was getting straight A's in special masters, and the other masters was definitely going to make it to becoming a physician. Was in my final semester, close to graduating. The research project had hit some hiccups because of the pandemic, so I might have had to take an extra summer to finish my research, but it's not like that was even great. I was definitely gonna, if nothing else, I could have done a library thesis. I was definitely going to graduate, have straight A's, and go to med school and start training and hopefully do surgical residencies. And then, as I was so freaking close, I could almost taste it, I got COVID for a second time. You can get more once, and I got long COVID after the second infection. So I'm disabled. But and the Soviets were shitty towards disabled people. They were not perfect, and they are not the best socialism can do. But there are valuable insights and things they did very well, despite that future socialist systems could do even better. Capitalism keeps people in constant precarity. So, because most people only have their work, their labor to sell. Sorry, I don't know if the noise canceling meant that. Because most people only have their labor to sell under capitalism. They are, and because the billionaire class, the capitalists, this is what Marx called the capitalists, the people who own big businesses. These are the big bankers, the billionaires. These are Elon Musk. Capitalist is not anyone who believes in capitalism in this lingo. Capitalist is specifically the big business owners, the bankers, the millionaire politicians who are their puppets. These people, very, very rich, $100 million plus club, make sure that welfare systems are always underfunded under capitalism to protect their own power. It's complicated, the relationships, why, and part of it is so that people can get the idea the government can do stuff to help them, and maybe get the idea of the government nationalizing certain companies, or just to try and discredit left-wing economics in general, because as an old joke says, a Republican is a man who says the government can't do anything to help you, and if you elect me to office, I'll prove it. They make the government useless. They intentionally make, say, welfare agencies bureaucratic and hard to work with, so people won't trust government and won't want to do more of it. They're evil shits, and they keep people in precarity. The very, very wealthy, the powerful elites of our society under a capitalist system like the United States where I live. And why do they keep people precarious? Partly so that there's a ready, desperate segment of the population to scare most of the workers, who can act as strike breakers, who can scare them that if they don't go along with the system, they'll end up like that. And will those people be given a chance? capitalism always relies on having what Marx referred to as a reserve army of labor, uh, the unemployed and the precariously employed. And people who say can't even work are kept extremely precarious, disabled long COVID, fully. I struggle to do YouTube, and I'm not doing a great job of this. I know. I get too easily distracted. I have trouble focusing. I have trouble multitasking, so keeping my voice. People have told me I have an excellent public speaking voice if I focus on it. And it was very, very good before I got long COVID. But I have trouble thinking about ideas, monitoring how my voice sounds, scrolling through the stuff all at the same time. This is very much something I can barely do, and I'm struggling to break through here on YouTube, and the algorithm is probably intentionally screwing me because it attacks left-wing channels, doesn't give them as many views. It doesn't outright remove stuff usually unless you're in the third world. Like if you're in Vietnam and you produce left-wing content for an American audience, your videos will get pulled. I've my best friend college is in Vietnam. There's a channel I sometimes watch where the guy is in Vietnam. He complains about the censorship he faces. So the censorship is sometimes blatant, but if you're an American, it's usually just that YouTube will show like 3 people your videos. All right, it's a little bit of exaggeration, but I'll get like, 3,000 impressions, whereas right-wing stuff will get 300,000 impressions, and so they'll get a lot more views and a lot more subscribers and grow their channel faster. It's much harder to break through as a left-wing channel. Of course, the population being propagandized against left-wing ideas doesn't help either. There's some degree to which this is because there's less of a receptive audience, and this is because of the billionaire control of the education system increasingly. Colleges and universities are run by these enormously powerful boards of trustees. These are right-wingers, and they will say fire professors who have Marxist sympathies. So you don't see as many young people being taught these ideas, so necessarily that weakens the left. Never mind state universities having people fired if they don't say what the government wants them to say in like Florida. And this, anyways, precarity leads to people accepting things they should never have to accept. I'm in a bad situation. For instance, I'm in a short-term housing kind of situation. The landlord could easily get rid of me. I don't have a lot of legal protections than normal housing place would have, where it's harder to get rid of someone just on a whim. And so I had to accept like stuff that was honestly physical abuse from one of the people I'm staying with, where a guy, I walked down in the morning and I was trying to get something in the fridge and there were some cherries in the way, so I moved them towards a fruit drawer. They weren't this guy's cherries and they weren't mine. I was just moving out of the way, seeing if there was room in the fruit drawer for them, opened it, and he was like, "What are you doing?" And then, "You shouldn't move my stuff out of the way." It wasn't his stuff. Apparently someone had been moving his stuff. And then the guy like didn't give me a chance to talk, and he put his hand on my face, like over my nose, almost like across above my eyes, all the way down to like my chin. I have not the biggest face, so it's easy. And like pushed me back a few feet and held his other hand threateningly, like it's gonna hit me or something. But he didn't. He got a hold of himself, but it was scary. And in this situation, because I left an abusive situation with family where I got slapped a couple times by family members, same with 2 times that I know for sure, might have been 3, but yeah, and left this situation where I was being threatened with further physical violence, and I lost my temper with this person. People expect perfect victims, but especially men, usually, if they're facing threats or actual physical violence, they're more likely to like either with words or other ways to retaliate. Not, I mean, men in the United States are socialized to be more like less control of their temper and less likely to take abuse from people without at least saying or doing something. That doesn't mean men can't be abused, and we are. Just that there's going to be at least some attempt at like retaliation, whether it's swearing at the person and being loud who's like doing horrible things to you, or it's a really stressful story on it here, and it's bullshit, and it shows the injustices in the system, how the system has, in fact, not helped me and put me at risk instead of the person who was being abusive to me. And, and there's housing assistance programs, but they have insanely long wait lists. Even if you can get priority, it's often still way too long for my savings will run out like a year and a half. And yeah, so I come here to try and at least be away from that abusive situation. Not that I really have much choice. It's how it worked out at the end. And then I have to deal with this shit. And I would leave in a heartbeat, but housing is so scarce in the United States because there's a housing shortage and rent is way too high. And it's hard to even find roommates, which there's a lot of people who they're afraid to like go out and search for new stuff, partly because landlords can get away with scamming them far too often, or just denying them for housing without giving them an explanation. Various problems with the system make people less likely to look for housing. And people are kept precarious. They're kept precarious in their housing situations and their ability to afford health care. There's a different roommate, one who I get along with, apparently faced like a healthcare denial. And he's a really nice guy. In the country he came from, he was a working professional, high status job. I won't say what to out of respect for his privacy. But you come to U.S. and you have to work much shittier jobs than what you did in your country. Short-term housing, a lot of like recent immigrants who are here legally, like have green cards or whatever, but they come through, and they don't stay long, and they leave. They're just getting settled, finding more permanent housing. But so they're around a couple months, maybe at most. I haven't been here a couple months, and now there's a crop of people probably be here till I leave. But for a while, it was more turnover. Depends the time of year, anyways. So people are kept precarious, especially disabled. Especially disabled people often try to pressure to do work, even if they're really too sick to do it, or it's not possible to support themselves. They can just do a tiny bit. And the system will provide them too little support regardless. Many disabled people be given so little government help that they end up homeless despite working. Like they can maybe work a few hours a week at one of the few employers who make disability accommodations, but it's not enough to pay rent. Government doesn't do anything to help. Rent's too high. They end up not being able to make rent. They fall out on the streets. And they were working and they were disabled, and it doesn't fucking matter because capitalism is monstrous and terrible. It's not working. Anyone who says it's working is full of shit. They don't know the actual status quo. They don't know the history of capitalism. They don't know the many, 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 many crimes it's committed, the many genocides the United States has helped to support, such as the Indonesian genocide, the Bangladeshi genocide, the first and second Congo genocides, the Guatemalan genocide. It's horrible the things the United States has done. It did far worse than anything the Soviet Union ever did. And just on that grounds alone, the United States deserved to lose the Cold War. A country that does that many genocides should have lost. If might made right, if the good guys always won, the United States would have lost and the Soviet Union would have won the Cold War because they were the lesser evil for sure. The United States murdered so many people in the third world, and because capitalism exports its misery and then hides it and suppresses media coverage in these third world countries, they often have dictatorships that attack journalists and such, and then controls flow of information back to the imperial core. People in the United States don't know half the things. They don't know that U.S. aid helped support the Guatemalan genocide, which murdered the Mayan people because they were in the way of resource exploitation in Guatemala. They don't know about the Indonesian genocide that mass murdered over 1 million socialist trade unionists and their families in Indonesia, or the Bangladeshi genocide that almost led to World War III because Bangladesh wanted independence from Pakistan, which it achieved in the end, and the Soviets tried to stop the United States from sending guns and ammo to Bangladesh to support the Pakistani government trying to mass murder people in Bangladesh, which happened, and there were religious tension elements into it and such too, as well as people being targeted for their political beliefs, as well as being targeted based on ethnicity. It was a complicated event, and it could have been much worse in terms of the number of people dying. It could have been much, much worse in terms of it could have led to a global thermonuclear war just because the U.S. did not want to have Kissinger's little plan, because it was a Henry Kissinger thing, the Bangladeshi genocide, be defeated. Kissinger was a monster. And yeah, so even in the Paracore, people like me are kept precarious. They're forced to live. I can't, in bad situations, I can't just pick up and leave because there are too few alternative options and rents are too high, and I'm already in one of the lowest rent places available short term. And it's hard to find longer term roommates who aren't like, people turn to criminality sometimes because they're so oppressed and marginalized. There'd be less crime if society took better care of the poor, so I have to worry about ending up when I'm looking for roommates, people potentially criminals, not usually violent criminals, but we're talking people who do scams and fraud because they're trying to survive in a system that keeps them desperate. I sympathize for them. Doesn't mean I want to live with them, especially because they could defraud me. So I have to be very picky, very careful, and capitalism creates these problems. I am a fan, and I've talked about this before, of universal basic income. It is something that would, among other things, make the provision of assistance to those most struggling in society more efficient, because rather than do means testing and paperwork and bureaucracy, and then you get bullshit like I recently had problems with one government office did not, one social security office did not hand off my case when I moved to the one that was my new geographical area. And they reported to a congressperson's office who I had to investigate that I had not filed an appeal when they initially rejected my SSI claim based on a missing piece of paperwork, which they tried to misrepresent as a medical denial. It was not a medical denial. It was a piece of paperwork that was only tangentially related to medical stuff. Specifically like this work history thing, which is not really what's your medical stats, it's what jobs did you do in the past. And I told them I just need more time. Then I told the private for-profit agency they were contracting out this to, and then they wouldn't answer my calls and stuff when I occasionally called, so I could, maybe clarify things I was confused about in the forum, and then they just reject the thing to missing paperwork. Now this, and then I filed an appeal based on this, and then filed an appeal and then got in the missing forms a while later, and they tried to lie to the congressperson's office and say there was no appeal. Outright lie. I sent the congressperson's office a picture of the stamped with a received stamp form that was given to the Social Security office where I am now rather than where it was. Yeah, they inquired with the previous office, and the previous office would have had access to this data. They were just lying. And why were they lying? Because they're shitty people and bureaucrats who've been encouraged to only hurt the people who need help, because people want to actually help are quickly pushed out. And the billionaire class wants bureaucrats like that. They don't want people to get, say, SSI, because then they're less desperate. Then they are less willing to put up with anything and work for minimum wage and still get fired whenever there's an economic slowdown if they're partially or fully disabled. They want people to not try and form unions. They want, and people who are at the very bottom are excellent for potentially union busting, acting as scabs if there's a strike, they think. Although that's becoming outdated, but it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It only matters that the billionaires still think that those things can be done. If a lot of billionaires are older and they're not up to date with the times, but their beliefs may have been true 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. 50, because even though it's before a time, their parents taught them stuff that was already becoming outdated. Billionaires don't magically know everything, but they believe things to be true, and so they act in ways based on what they believe to be true. Humans always do. You might call me a socialist humanist. You get these Marxists who take materialism, dialectic materialism, too far, and they refuse to accept that some degree what matters is not always reality, but what people think about reality. That's not to say there isn't an external reality, that reality doesn't determine consciousness to a degree, of course, accepting religious supernatural stuff, which I am a Christian, again. But humans' behavior is not conditioned by reality. Humans' behavior is conditioned by their perception of reality. It's complicated. The idealist, which is the idea that ideas determine reality, versus materialist divide is more complicated than just one side being right, one being wrong. In a way, they're both wrong because they both take extreme positions, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle between the two. So I'm a socialist humanist. I am on the material side of things. It would be hard not to be, having been a scientist, a biologist, Modern science is very much based on materialist worldviews, whereas almost everything else in society is based on idealist views, which is probably why they're more socialist among scientists, though they don't talk about it publicly for fear of being unable to get grant funding. But scientists are more likely to be Marxists than most of the rest of the United States society, which is still a very low probability, but because they're materialist worldview. And Marxism is scientific socialism in its own words. That's true, although not scientific in the sense that it's fact or something, but it takes a scientific approach to problems sometimes. But science still requires training. A lot of Marxists think if they just take the words, they treat Marxism almost like religion, which of course makes the same mistakes capitalists make. They just repeat them because they're trained to think that way and they don't fully put it behind them. Anyways, I'm a fan of universal basic income. You get these dumb Marxists who say things like, oh, it's a band-aid on a flesh wound. Well, it only treats the symptoms of capitalism, not the problem. That may be true, but it does treat the symptoms, and it stops people from dying deaths of homelessness and despair. It prevents people from slipping through the cracks of the welfare system that finds all sorts of excuses not to help. For instance, saying I can't get SSDI, that's separate from SSI, because I don't have enough work credits narrowly because jobs that I worked, right? Let me repeat. For university while I was a graduate student, did not contribute payroll tax and didn't earn me any work credits simply because of this rule. And the mid-90s, because this was not the case before, like 1994, when Newt Gingrich sat down with Bill Clinton and poked the welfare system full of holes to fuck over poor people. And this is one of the holes, one of the exceptions he added that narrowly cheated me out of having the necessary work credits. Now, I was in a precarious situation already because of gaps in my employment history and such, so I would have barely had the work credits, but I would have had the work credits if not for this bullshit rule. And there's nothing I can do about it. There's not even a way I can't appeal that. I can't take it to a court judge or whatever. It's very clear that I don't have the work credits because this rule, even though the rule is blatantly unjust, should have never existed. And this is the problem with bureaucracy. Little rules can come in that no one even knows exist. Too much is hidden from public oversight. It's not democratic. Bureaucracy that's unaccountable is not democratic. This is a problem in capitalism, neoliberalism especially. This is a problem even in socialism. In the Soviet Union, there were unaccountable bureaucrats. So even if the government was the Socialist Party that was elected by the people, unfortunately, it was the only party that was allowed to exist. And even though there were essentially free primaries within the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, you can think of it as primaries. They weren't called primaries, but that is something that was basically a sort of primary. The people who could run within the party for office, like to be the candidates in the first place, who would then go to the general election, where it would just be a yes/no vote, and if it was no vote, there'd have to be a new primary, essentially. And that almost never happened. 96% of the time, people elected the one candidate was on the ballot, but the candidate who would be on the ballot was selected at a primary. They called it mass meetings or various other things, but they basically have smaller elections to determine. Of course, one of the problems with these elections is for a long time they were not secret ballot elections. They were show of hand elections, which the secret police was watching, and so people don't always feel comfortable going against whatever. You'd have like a secret police guy say, I endorse this guy, and everyone would be afraid to go against them. Eventually, they did move to secret ballots. Realizing the problems, but it took a long time, and people still made propaganda hay out of before that. And yeah, the Soviet Union failed to reform itself and fix its problems. And this is partly because it was under so much pressure from the United States, it couldn't make big experiments without risking collapse. And indeed, when it made big experiments under Gorbachev, it did collapse, partly because there were people who were working to destroy the system from within because they bought into propaganda that the United States was pushing into the Soviet Union, which destabilized it. Radio Free America and such bullshit. And you had people in the Soviet government who listened to Radio Free America under the Gorbachev regime. Or Radio Free Asia, or whatever. Radio Free Europe. Sorry, Radio Free America is the one in the Americas. So I misspoke. Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia. Propaganda, outright lies, basically CIA lies that were being pushed into Soviet airspace with like radio towers right on the border of like Warsaw Pact and such. Even today, they still spread lies. the Radio Free Asia and stuff, they still have websites. They still spread outright lies online and in news programs occasionally, and they still get away with this bullshit. They're lying pieces monsters, and they should be taken off the air, just like USAID. I shed no tears over the closure. Radio Free America, Radio Free Asia, Europe, those need to be closed as well. Maybe Trump could do it because he thinks it's wasteful spending. I doubt it. He's smart enough to know the value of propaganda. And yeah, I have no sympathy for Trump. He's a piece of shit, but sometimes he destroys evil programs just because he's sloppy and doesn't know what he's doing, as he did with USAID, which is a horrible, corrupted agency. Hopefully, if Trump is ever gone and we don't end up in a fascist dictatorship, hopefully we don't just bring back USAID, but create a new organization with new leadership to replace the functionality of providing foreign aid, one that isn't associated with CIA and genocide and spies infiltrating through the ranks into other countries and such. As UBI reduces the people falling through cracks, it means people don't have to fill out tons of forms to get help. Maybe just a simple direct deposit form. That's it. There should be, or maybe improved citizenship perhaps as well. Although, really, because you've risked creating an underclass, UBI should be available to citizens and non-citizens alike, even though it's less politically popular. But minimal bureaucracy, less paperwork, saves people time who have to fill out the paperwork. Also saves, though, having bureaucrats who exist only to do the paperwork. And some people get Marxists and say, oh, that's bad. Bureaucrats are valuable. Bureaucrats are valuable. They can be doing other things. They can be creating and administrating, rather, politicians create bureaucrats. They can be administrating other programs to help people that can't exist right now because those bureaucrats are busy and the government only has so much money to spend. The labor can be spent on other things in a society that's actually functional. And even if that doesn't happen under a capital system, the bureaucrats just get laid off. At least it stops people from slipping through the cracks and ending up homeless and getting cheated out of programs they thought they would have, like SSDI. I mean, I wasn't planning on becoming disabled, but I always thought if it somehow happened, I'd be able to get SSDI. I didn't read their obscure rules and realize it was full of holes, and there was this work credit system. They would fuck you out of work credits for jobs you thought would be paying them and so forth. I had no idea this was the case. I tried to even deny that I worked jobs that I hadn't earned work credits just because it was on the list. It's like, yeah, sure, it didn't pay payroll tax because you had this exception where they don't have to. But I did work this. The IRS has records of my working this job. It's just that it didn't contribute payroll tax because university didn't have to for the people who were at least half-time students. Even though I had coworkers who were not half-time students that were paying payroll tax, which meant a little bit like the way payroll tax works in the U.S. is they take money out of your paycheck and the employer matches it. So they're actually paying you a little bit extra if you're getting payroll tax contributions. So Gingrich did this and it saved universities a little bit of money. And this was the same time universities were being turned into even more heavily controlled capitalist enterprises that are being, quote, run like businesses. And now you have presidents of universities paying themselves multi-million-dollar salaries. And often the board of trustees are drawn from big businessmen, and they're, getting rich off of the opportunities and connections they make through a university. And it just makes the rich richer, and makes the problems of capitalism worse versus a better way of administrating universities where you don't have this bullshit happening. So yeah, UBI is not just a band-aid and a flesh wound. It won't solve all the problems, but it can increase efficiency government. It can allow bureaucrats to do other things, such as you got Mandani running in New York City right now and talking about creating a couple publicly run or funded, I hope he's talking actually government owned, though he's probably just contracted out or some bullshit, grocery stores in New York City in areas that have been identified as food deserts, where you can't get fresh groceries in certain neighborhoods. So the government will just go in and open a grocery store there and maybe run it even slightly at a slight loss, just because the health benefits the population of having healthier food, and it'll actually benefit the city more than whatever if they, what the prices they charge for food don't quite cover their costs. Private enterprise couldn't run a slight loss like that, but the government can and have it pay for itself many times over and other benefits to society, because there are what's known as positive externalities. Externalities can be like pollution that harms other people, or it can be positive externalities like if you do this thing, people will be healthier in the community and that will increase government tax revenue. This is an externality. You don't personally, if you're, say, a capitalist business, and you don't enjoy these benefits, but they are benefits of society. Even the neoliberal economists realize the importance of integrating externalities, but the free market has shown it cannot do that. So, but government can take externalities to account in a way that private companies cannot. And this is one reason economic planning is valuable and actually, in many cases, superior to private market force businesses. Private isn't privately owned, isn't owned by billionaires, as opposed to, say, a workers' cooperative owned by the employees. But workers' cooperatives are still market socialists, and there is value for planning, because even a workers' cooperative can't take into account, say, if I do this, it'll make the community healthier. The workers don't benefit from that, even a workers' cooperative. But a government-owned industry can take that into account. Workers' cooperatives will also be driven to do relatively more environmental pollution and more CO2 and stuff if they can get away with it. Still benefits the workers. They're going to do less than a normal capitalist enterprise. Well, they aren't capitalist workers' cooperatives. Workers' cooperatives going to pollute less than the capitalist enterprise, but still more in a government-owned one if the government has environmentalist values, which the Soviet Union did not, but it could have prioritized environmentalism. They prioritized their military and economic growth at all costs. Wage subsidies are something I don't talk about enough. They're an excellent idea. They could, where the government will say, we'll pay a percentage of this person's salary for so long after hiring them, usually. This is done in some capitalist countries already to help recent college graduates get their first job. It could also be used to help people who've, say, become disabled and can't do their previous work, but might be able to do some other kind of job, get back into the workforce. Or people who are disabled and they can produce some economic value, but not enough to even cover the minimum wage, where the government pays half their minimum wage. And sometimes it's like ticket to work programs and stuff where I don't understand fully what goes on there, but they may already exist as wage subsidies. The government may be paying part of a wage to reduce someone's reliance on SSI, SSDI. But these programs aren't large enough. They don't have the reach. Wage subsidies should be done on a broad scale throughout the United States. And I'm sure you even get people on the left say, oh, we're putting money into the pockets of billionaires. Yeah, because billionaires won't do anything unless you give them money, which is why we need to get rid of billionaires in the long run and reduce them to working for a living like everyone else. Get rid of as in force them to become working class. But if you're going to be stuck with capitalism, wage subsidies will help people survive, and they'll show that government can help people, which will actually pave the way for socialism. A lot of the bullshit of, oh, if we prop up capitalism, we'll never... If nobody thinks the government can help them, you're never going to get socialism either. This accelerationist stuff is bullshit. Marxists will earn more goodwill by working for things that help ordinary people, even if they make the capitalist system collapse slower, and actually have a better chance of taking over when capitalism collapses instead of the fascists taking over, which is what's happening in the United States. If neoliberal democracy collapses, it's not really a democracy, it's an oligarchy at this point, but if the current system collapses, it will be fascist dictatorship, right-wing, xenophobic, militaristic dictatorship, i.e. fascism, that even if it's not codified, it doesn't have all the principles that Mussolini laid out as fascist. It will be the fascists take over the United States, not the socialists right now, if capitalism collapses. The socialists need to build their credentials. That involves working on things that help people, even if they prop up the system, like universal basic income, like wage subsidies. So even just if from a tactical perspective it makes sense. And UBI would free up government bureaucrats to work on stuff like wage subsidies, to work on stuff like direct grocery stores and food deserts, maybe a roommate finder website. There are some already. They suck. They don't have far enough reach. If the government did it and they put their weight and their platform behind it, presidents would say, go to this website and use the new government roommate finder app. It might help people who are really barely keeping roofs over their head to not end up homeless. Maybe something similar with public gardens. I mean, they exist, but people don't always know where they are or how to use them. A website that organizes that information. And the creation of more public gardens, which are already technically a type of socialism in a certain sense. I mean, the government already does some things that might become socialist, where they provide services not for market forces and not owned by billionaires. That is socialism. Socialism is not generous social spending. not welfare. That's nothing socialist about welfare, but there is when the government provides a direct service, that's socialism. So fire departments are technically socialism. Public education is socialist. This is true. Of course, having a tiny, tiny bit of socialism in a 99% capitalist system does not a socialist system make. The United States is vast majority capitalist, whereas, say, China is a mix of capitalism and socialism. And China has achieved enormous amounts of economic growth, impossible things, seemingly impossible things that even the Soviet Union didn't achieve. The Soviet Union had not lost the Cold War. The Cold War is still ongoing. It hadn't collapsed. The Soviet Union would have been projected to eclipse the United States economy in about 2070 or 2080. China has done that already. Let me reiterate this. It would have taken the Soviet Union about 50 more years to accomplish what China has already, now in 2025, already achieved. Because, Soviet Union did outgrow the United States. That's how it was ever able to have a projected point where it would eclipse, because it grew faster in GDP per capita percentage growth rates. So, if your size of your economy is $100 GDP per person in your country, doubling that in a year is a faster growth rate than if you have 100,000 per person, you only add 1,000 a year. That's a 1% growth rate. Soviet Union had a higher percentage growth rate, and since they showed no signs of that slowing down quickly enough to prevent them from, they would have different projections based on how much their economic growth would slow as they became wealthier showed different points, but at some point they were going to eclipse the U.S. economy, probably around 2070, 2080. So it wouldn't have happened even now, although they would have been wealthier now if they hadn't collapsed than they were before they collapsed. There would be less of a gap, and that gap would get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller every year. And 2070, 80 isn't GDP per capita eclipsing the U.S., not being wealthier per person. It's just that their economy would have been bigger in absolute terms in the U.S. at that point. Which was based partly on projections of estimated population growth rates in the future of the U.S. during the Cold War, as it historically happened. Immigration was very high into the U.S., but it was slowing down, and fertility rates in the U.S. were still relatively high, but they were falling, and Soviet fertility rates actually fell earlier because they did a lot of women's education, but then they didn't keep falling as quickly because once the women were educated, they were educated, whereas the U.S. was actually playing catch-up to the Soviet Union in terms of rates of women's education. There were many ways the Soviets were ahead of the United States, and higher rates of women attending college and graduate school was one of them. Better women's rights in the Soviet Union, that is a fact. There were problems in like the Warsaw Pact with Romania outlawing abortionship, and the Soviet Union proper. Women could attend college for free, and it was much more accessible. Whereas women in the U.S. weren't even allowed to have private bank accounts at the same time that the Soviet women were getting PhDs in record numbers. Bank accounts without their husbands signing off, I should say. The U.S. was way, way, way behind the Soviet Union in that regard. Economically, they may have still been ahead, but the Soviets were ahead in many things, and the number of things they were ahead in would have just kept growing over time. The U.S. had to spend enormous amounts of resources to surpass the Soviets in their space program. The Soviets initially were ahead of the U.S., for instance, and individual things the U.S. might have caught up, but at the expense of falling behind and, to surpass the Soviets in the space program, that the U.S. actually fell behind in several other aspects of its society because it required a massive infusion of resources the U.S. was only able to do because it was a wealthier country in the Soviet Union, and that was changing over time. China is now already has a bigger economy in the U.S., not bigger economy per person, but China's population has below replacement birth rates, which means eventually their population will fall, given enough time to the size the U.S. population is. So if let's say the U.S. maintains stagnant population growth and China's population shrinks until it's the same size as the U.S., their economy just only has to keep pace with the U.S. at this point, and then they'll be a wealthier country per person in terms of, higher output per person. Wealth is not the same as output. If your income is higher, but someone else has had that income level for 70 years, it's going to take a while to accumulate the same amount of wealth, even though your income is higher. So even once you eclipse a country in GDP or GDP per capita, it takes a long time, for instance, for China to catch up to the U.S. level of military technology, which is not a per capita cost, it's a fixed cost. It doesn't cost more money to develop a new type of stealth fighter just because you have twice as many people. Cost is a fixed cost. It's the same amount either way. So China will eventually surpass the US in military tech, but it'll probably take 100 years. And the US is likely to attack them before that happens. Because the US is imperialist. If it doesn't collapse, it will. It's trying to gear up for war with China and slowly, over the course of decades, make a case for it right now. Or maybe sooner in decades, but I predict it won't be for 30, 40 years. Partly, I would have predicted sooner in the past, but Trump's fascist plans to drum up hatred of China have fallen on more difficult than he expected, or than I expected. And so instead, he's victimized immigrants, which kind of came out of the blue. I expect such a huge deportation thing, but that's because he wasn't able to make fearmonger about China half as hard as he hoped to. So he shifted to immigrants. Trump will always find someone to victimize, and capitalist elites always will, because they can't have people realize the billionaires are the real problem. These elites are the puppets of billionaires. They get campaign donations for billionaires, which everyone talks about, but the people don't talk about is they also get book deals, speaking fees, and insider trading tips that allow the politicians who come in with less than $1 million to become multimillionaires within, a fairly short period of time often. They become not nearly as wealthy as the billionaires who control them, but they become quite wealthy through what's essentially legalized bribery. Stuff like a billionaire will fund a think tank. They've been funding this think tank for 70 years, or, well, not 70 years, 30 years. And this right-wing think tank will buy 10,000 copies of a shitty book that a politician writes. It's terribly written, but since the politician gets a portion of the proceeds in book sales, it's essentially putting money in the pocket of the politician. And then the think tank will have trouble finding anything to do with the books. They'll send it to universities or high schools for free, and no one will read it because it's a shitty book half the time. But if someone does read it, it serves a dual purpose of propaganda, because these books are written to be propaganda on behalf of the billionaires and for capitalism. So they get a little bit of value out of that, but mostly it's a form of just putting money in the pockets of politicians. It's direct bribery, and it doesn't get talked about nearly as much as campaign donations, even though it's definitely a factor in politician behavior, that they get literal bribery in the form of book deals and speaking fees, where they go and speak for an hour and get paid $10,000. Again, money in their pocket, not money for campaign ads. It's corruption, it's theft, it's bribery, it's evil, and it's only going to get worse because the billionaires are trying to corrupt politicians more and more, so there's no chance the politicians do anything that threatens their power. Because, some politicians come up with good ideas, and some try to hold on to a few of them even as they get corrupted in most other ways. The billionaires want more power, more control, and then they want the government to have more control while they control the government more, so they can use the government to increase their own power. Cut taxes on the billionaires, increase taxes on everyone else to make up a little bit of the government debt, the government difference, run up the debt, so most of the money that does come in taxes goes just to paying interest on the debt, which is money in the pockets of billionaires. So eventually we get to a point where like half the money brings in as taxes just goes to interest on debt, that basically money is taken from working people and just handed to billionaires for what should have been taxed from them a long time ago. Instead, they hold, U.S. government bonds. Sometimes other countries will buy this debt, but a lot of it is owned domestically. Some of it's like owned by Social Security, which there's whole issues with Social Security funds being raided to fund like military enterprises and stuff. So it's a mess, and it's deeply corrupt, and problem built on problem built on problem. Capitalism is eating itself, just as Marx predicted. It just has taken a lot longer, and it's still going to be a while longer to anything like the collapse as he predicted. Marx was right. He just was overly optimistic about how quickly things would change. Change is happening. This capitalist system is destroying itself, and maybe socialism can rise from the ashes, but it's going to take hundreds of years, not a couple generations like Marx thought. He thought we get in 70 years what might not happen for 300 years. But it will happen. The signs are clear. He was right. He was just, his timelines were off. Environmentalism, climate change, climate disaster, the existential threat to humanity that is global warming, is climate collapse, is climate change, is the mass extinction event we are currently in the middle of, losing species, particularly insect species and various fungi and lichens and stuff at an amazing rate, And these organisms provide important environmental services. So it destroys the very basis of the ecology. So even if we stop doing damage today, we're not getting those species back. It takes tens, millions, hundreds of millions of years for them to have evolved. That biodiversity is gone for good. And we're destroying the planet. So that even whatever, if we can reach an equilibrium tomorrow, it will be an equilibrium where the environment is less healthy than it would have been if we'd reached that equilibrium 50 years ago. That damage takes tens, hundreds of millions of years to heal. We are doing enormous damage. Even if humanity doesn't go extinct, we'll make the Earth a lot less habitable than it would have otherwise been. The environment would be less healthy, crop yields would be lower than they otherwise would have. There'll be more problems with pollution, with droughts, all sorts of things. And also some of these organisms could have been sources of medicines. You go into the rainforest, you find sources of like anti-cancer drugs and stuff. These species are going extinct before we can even get to them. It's horrible. Climate change is an existential threat to humanity. Let's not even forget the hurricanes, the sea level rises, droughts, and then on top of that, the mass extinction. And all that carbon is just going to be sitting in the atmosphere. It's just going to be circling. It's not going anywhere. It also takes millions of years to deposit underground, unless you like pump it underground. A lot of those pumping schemes have the risk that CO2 could find a leak and just bubble back to the surface, and you just waste a bunch of energy pumping it underground. We have to bring climate change under control. This is one of the strongest arguments against capitalism. Capitalism will not achieve ecological harmony. It's actually seeking, as many socialists say, infinite growth on a finite planet. You actually can achieve, in a sense, infinite growth, but only if you're willing to accept very, very low growth rates. And most of the growth not being due to adding new things that damage the planet, not due to manufacturing more stuff, but like scientific innovation. Technically, finding a cure for cancer grows the economy, but it doesn't actually increase environmental damage, provided you don't cause the population to grow due to that. It's infinite growth is technically possible, but it's not possible at the kind of rates we're talking. You might be able to achieve 0.1% growth a year sustainably for centuries. But at some point, you have to stop doing this 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, 15% growth rates a year. That's not environmentally sustainable, never will be on a finite planet, and we are reaching Earth's limits. And people get threatened by this. They hate someone saying this because they feel like, oh, then my life won't get better if the economy doesn't grow. You could already have a much, 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 much better life if resources were distributed more equally. And the government could also cushion changes need to happen. Like, we need to shrink the human population so that what we already produce is enough to serve people, give them a better standard of living, because the same amount of production with fewer humans. Find an equilibrium with less humans on the planet, and that needs to be done in an equitable way. And the people who are the biggest offenders who need to have reduced the birth rates the most are people in rich countries in the United States. Yeah, I know maybe you want to have kids. I know kids are precious. At one point in my life, wanted to have a whole big family myself someday, and then I realized climate change. You can't have these enormous families with climate change being what it is. People need to have 0 or 1 kids. Single child families or no child families intentionally. Doesn't mean you shouldn't get married and stuff. I just encourage people to do that. In fact, it's more ecologically sustainable because you're more likely to be sharing housing and using less of it that way. Housing has a major environmental impact. But people should refrain from having children even though they get married. Marriage is good for society. Kids, not good. We need to shrink Earth's population by a lot. Not because we can't feed all the people or some bullshit right now, but because we won't be able to feed all the people when crop yields are like 1/10 what they are now, or 1/50th, because of droughts and sea level rise and hurricanes and mass extinction. We're not going to be able to sustainably feed this many people because of climate change without massive increases in, say, energy use. And if you increase energy use that much to keep crop yields where they are, then say you grow stuff hydroponically with artificial lighting because you can't get the crop yields outside you used to be able to because of mass extinctions. That's going to take a ton of energy, and if it comes from burning coal and natural gas, you're going to make climate change worse faster. And so even though people won't starve, and you'll get stuff like water shortages, which will also affect the hydroponics, of course, or even aeroponics, which is more water efficient, is what they do on the International Space Station, for instance. That's where you use a fine water mist instead of submerging crop roots in water. And some crops can be grown aeroponically where the roots would rot. Some crops are less tolerant of having the roots submerged than others. But even with aeroponics, it still uses water. We're going to have freshwater shortages. We're going to have water wars in much of the developing world. They can't afford these hydroponics and stuff. People are going to starve because even though we could grow the food, capitalism has kept people that are so poor they can't afford hydroponically grown vegetables that cost $1,000 for a bag of groceries or something ridiculous. I'm exaggerating a little. Well, with inflation, $1,000 then might be like $100 today, so not, or a couple hundred, but they can afford groceries at that price. They will starve even though it's possible to feed them because capitalism does that. Billions with a B will die due to climate crisis within 100, 150 years. If we don't, 200 years maybe, if we don't rein it in. There's the worst stuff. People always look, to the end of the century. No, look what's going to happen in 2120, 2150. We're going to have enormous problems. The worst stuff is going to happen after the 21st century. The 22nd century is going to suck if we don't bring climate crisis in, rein it in. And capitalism can't achieve that. So even if it leads to slower economic growth, even if it's more expensive, even if it leads to some falls in standards of living, we need socialism, because socialism with government planning can prevent this kind of climate change, can have governments nationalize industries and say, okay, we're just going to stop drilling for oil. Even if it hurts our economy, we're going to do it because we can't survive on this planet if we keep drilling. Instead, we have this drill baby drill shit, which is making things worse, faster. It's partly because of competition with China, because the U.S. is terrified that they've been eclipsed by China economically, and they're trying to surpass China again and buy themselves more time until China ends up being more militarily powerful than the U.S., which will happen someday, even if China's GDP per capita doesn't grossly exceed the U.S., as long as they have some lead in total GDP. They will eventually have a more powerful military in the United States, and that terrifies the billionaires, because that means that the socialists could actually win in a military conflict at that point. Even if it doesn't happen for 150 years, they're not going to let that come anywhere close, because it's going to be hard to crush them the less of an inequality in military tech. Like, the U.S. has put so much money into its military that, they're like 2 generations ahead of China technologically. There's so much secret shit that we don't even know about. I had family who worked in the military industrial complex. One of them would often hint at this. We have so much top secret shit. It's so expensive, but China can actually put more money into those kind of development projects than we can at this point. And they're not doing so, actually. They're reinvesting in their economy, but they could. They could stay ahead of us economically and outspend us in military research and eventually eclipse us militarily. And at some point, they will increase their military budget, surpass that of the United States. They have not done so yet. The U.S. has a ridiculous military. It's like bigger than the next 6 countries combined in military spending. Won't be the case forever, because China will eventually ramp up its military spending. Probably not for another generation or 2. But at some point, they'll realize their strength, realize that the U.S. is likely to attack them, have solved some of the internal problems that they want to focus on solving right now, have dealt with like U.S. bullshit about, free trade and shit. This is an attempt to balkanize China, to break it up into little pieces, to make it weaker. Should not be allowed. We're the same country that fucking conquered the West and mass murdered the Native Americans, and we're sitting here and complaining because China's not mass murdering people in China. I mean, Tibet, they are not. That's a lie. But there is some cultural assimilation going on, and it's not even forced cultural assimilation, which would be terrible. It's usually just they'll build a train line into a little town in Tibet, and because housing prices are much higher further to the east, you'll get like, you build a train station in this little town of like 100 people, and then you get 30,000 people from Eastern China who moved there for the lower cost of living. China didn't force cultural assimilation, they just allowed their native population to drown out the culture that was there. That is what is actually occurring, despite the bullshit propaganda about Tibet and the Uyghurs, which is a little bit different. They had problems with terrorism that was being funded by the CIA. The CIA was funding terrorist networks in like Kazakhstan, basically, that were infiltrating in order to destabilize the government there so that they would turn to the US for help. The US has not successfully brought Kazakhstan to heel, but it is trying very hard. And one of the things the US does is it funds terrorists and denies it until decades later. But there's a lot of accusations of this, and they're almost certainly true, of funding terrorism in that part of the world. Then they crossed the border into Western China. Then there was terrorism. There were terrorist attacks in China like a few decades ago. And so what China did is they identified people who they considered to be at risk of terrorism, and they forced them into re-education camps where they were taught Marxist ideas. They were taught atheism. Their culture was not erased, but they were taught the languages that are spoken further east. They were pressured into atheism when they were Muslim, they were Islamic, and they were taught job skills and training, and they were tried to make them into Marxists. But they didn't do that to everyone. They did that to people who they specifically identified as possible threats of becoming like Al-Qaeda, blow themselves up terrorists. And it was sometimes much too far, but it is not what people in the West are being told is happening. It may have been wrong, but it is not what people think is happening, and that's important. There's a lot of lies. Because it's part of trying to drum up support for war with China and trying to at least create a situation where China will break into pieces or have like an insurgency in their West. That's what the CIA's wet dream. The US is evil. It runs an empire. It's committed like 9 genocides. It's no position to lecture anyone. And a lot of the things you think are going on in the rest of the world are bullshit. So I don't buy into, oh, Soviets were terrible, China is terrible. The people who say that are shit libs. They're ultras. They are monsters who would see nothing change, who don't even have much sympathy for, say, disabled people like myself who are slowly dying under the system. I don't know if the congressperson's office who have asked for help will be able to sort out the appeal that I filed that was buried in other office claiming I didn't file an appeal, even though I have a physical copy of the appeal, so I can prove that I submit it. I don't know. They'll drag this out until I'm homeless on the street and I can't follow up with stuff. And I don't have a mailing address, and they will. The system will kill me if I can't get my YouTube channel to where I can monetize it. Got maybe a year and a half. I've got to like March of 2027, then maybe April or May, and then I'm street homeless. And pretty soon thereafter dead, because people with long COVID, their bodies do not adapt to physical and emotional stress as well as a normal person. So something that would not kill a normal person will kill someone with long COVID in terms of like the physical stress of severe sleep deprivation, of stuff like homeless people get poisoned a lot. I worked with homeless people. I volunteered at homeless shelters and stuff. I saw a lot of them as EMT. So I know this. I've heard horror stories of people putting poison or broken glass in their food because people will shit on the homeless in the US because they're absolute psychopaths, and they know if they attack the most vulnerable, nothing will happen to them. Even if someone reports to the police won't take it seriously because a lot of police departments are full of fascists who hate the homeless and wish they were all dead. So I wound up dead with a capital D if I end up homeless, because with my long COVID, I will not be able to survive that situation. And yeah, there's shelters and stuff, but usually you can't like reserve in advance. You have to be there each night. And with my insomnia problems with long COVID, a lot of times it'll be hard to be up at the right times, be there at the right times. It won't work. It's impossible for me. I will end up dead because the system will murder me, because if I can't make profit for the billionaires, it can't even be useful enough with scaring working class people as a reserve army of labor because I'm not able to work, then the system will murder me, because capitalism is ruthless. Capitalism is evil. So please, fight back against the system. Push for change. Talk about Marxism, because Marxists can't do shit until we have a lot greater numbers. And then maybe we can start organizing strikes, walkouts, boycotts, things to push for changes like a better welfare system and eventually push for actual socialism, which is not social spending. Socialism is stuff like nationalizing industries, taking the banks away from the billionaires and having public banking services at post offices and having Amazon run by the government potentially and such. All right, well, I hope you folks enjoyed this video. Take care of each other, be kind to yourselves, and may you always find a guiding star to lead you home. I hope you see you folks later, and I hope you'll subscribe so you see my other videos. Adieu.